So the theme of this retreat, finding freedom in difficult times, in keeping with that, I would like to begin, this is our first talk of the retreat, about what's the very first word in that phrase is finding freedom. And so I want to spend a little time to start on what do we mean from a Dharma perspective about freedom. We have to know what we're looking for, where we're aiming, if we have any hope of getting there. So I want to say a little bit about that, and then continue on, well, if we have an idea of where we're aiming ourselves, what are things we can do that might help us move more to actualize that more in our lives. So that, in the Buddhist world, you'll hear different phrases that have a range of connotations for each of us: liberation, freedom. You'll hear awakening, realization, enlightenment. There's all these different terms, and they get thrown about a lot in all different traditions, not just within the Buddhist world. And people don't always necessarily mean the same things when they're using those phrases. And so there's not a right or wrong. We each have to find our own way of what we're looking for. But I want to offer one perspective from a Dharma perspective, and you can see how this lands for you or not. The important thing is to find what's alive in your own understanding. So to begin, I want to offer a reading. This is from the second great Taoist master. The first one was Lao Tzu. The second great master, my Chinese pronunciation's not good, but it's Zhuang Tzu. And he said, "I cannot tell if what the world considers happiness is happiness or not. All I know is that when I consider the way they go about attaining it, I see them carried away headlong, grim and obsessed in the general onrush of the human herd, unable to stop themselves or to change their direction. All the while they claim to be just on the point of attaining happiness." I think he's been a little rough here, but I see them carried away, headlong, grim and obsessed in the general onrush of the human herd. That's a powerful statement. Unable to stop themselves or to change their direction. I don't know about you, but I can certainly relate to a lot of that in my own life. And so what does he mean? I'm not going to read a lot of quotes, but I have one more here I'd like to share that I think captures the essence of things for me very well. This came from my very first teacher when I started my practice in 1970. I wasn't in the Buddhist world until maybe around the mid-70s. I started off in the more Hindu-oriented yoga traditions. My first teacher was Hari Das. He died just a couple of years ago, I think, in Santa Cruz here in California. And this is what he says. He says, "We live our entire existence from this point of view, seeking those things, situations, and people that make us happy, and avoiding those things that make us unhappy. But even when conditions seem ideal to us, there is always that nagging certainty somewhere in our minds that the situation will eventually change, that the security and happiness of the moment will ultimately be lost. In truth, we are never totally at peace. There is always something to be anxious about. Ordinary life is really a constant dilemma." And then he goes on to say that spirituality, learning how to live life as free, conscious, and loving beings instead of from the point of view of dilemma. And that sums up things nicely for me. And I want to use this approach. Some of his language is not traditional Buddhist language, but I think he captures things very well. And I like the idea, I'm signed up for that, is how can I learn to live life as a free, conscious, and loving being instead of from the point of view of dilemma. And so one of the, somebody said it was breaking up and they couldn't understand the quote. I won't, the quote's not important, but I think the essence of it is worthwhile. So let me back up for a moment and, basic Dharma, and it's an invitation to look into our own minds, is that probably all of us, just as human beings, I'll include myself, all of us to some extent, when you really start to pay attention to what's going on in our minds, oftentimes people don't stop to really look at their own minds. That's a lot of what we're doing. And sometimes people are horrified when they see what's going on. And in fact, sometimes people can feel like things aren't getting better when they meditate, it's getting worse. And in the sense that maybe it really is getting better, but they're noticing things that might have been happening, forces, the way their minds work that they just had not been aware of before. And it's what Haridas says is we seek those things, situations, experiences that we think will make us happy, avoiding those we think will make us unhappy. I don't take that as a criticism. Just to be a human being, to be a living being, isn't it true that, none of us here are trying to have less of the experiences you want to have happen, less of what you want, and have more of what you don't want happen to you. I mean, it sounds silly, but right, we all want to have more and more, we'd say, pleasant experiences. We want to have less unpleasant. So that's just natural as being not just a human being. I think I'm imagining even single-celled organisms. If there's one, say, for example, that doesn't like light and you shine the light, it'll probably, in the petri dish, will probably squirm away from the light. Or if there's a nutrient that it likes, it'll kind of move over towards it. So I think just being a living being, it's kind of built in. It's not a criticism, and I don't know that we're going to stop doing that. But if in the spirit of finding, what does it mean to find freedom? The problem is we don't have to stop being a human being, but the problem is if our happiness, or we could say if our well-being, is tied up entirely in having or not having certain experiences, then there is no freedom, because we're actually at the effect of circumstances. And if you're paying attention, the coronavirus pandemic has been very intense in a lot of ways. And one of them that really struck me is that, it was only 3 months ago, wasn't that long ago, we're all going about our business. I mean, there's plenty of things that have been worried about, right? Depending on your politics and climate change, and, we can go on and on. There's plenty of things already. And then this hits on top of it. I've been and I've done a lot of conscious practicing about, learning to let go and to be with things as they are, and all of these things we talk about. And when this thing first really was hitting, in a big way, one day I woke up just in fear. I couldn't stop it and I couldn't get away. Not only, it may have been rational, but it was kind of irrational. Between the actual COVID-19, the disease itself, and it was unknown back then, is there going to be a run on food, people hoarding food? I didn't know, how bad is it going to be? How bad's the economy going to be? Are we really going back into like the real Great Depression back in the 30s or worse? It was so unknown. And I remember one morning, and I couldn't let it go. I couldn't shake it. And I was just in this fear. And I tried all the techniques and strategies I know. And at the end, I had to just letting go wasn't that the fear went out of my mind. The letting go was a letting be. Can I be with this fear? And that was what I really realized the task was. I give that as an example of life. You know, we're all going to continue trying to make life be how we want it to be. I don't think we're going to stop that. I don't think we should stop that. And so you want to take care of yourself. You want to set the causes and conditions up to be supportive and to care for yourself, of course. And then at the end of the day, you get what you get. And so the whole question from a Dharma point of view is, what are we going to do with you get what you get? And one way to think about it is, can we find ways to start to shift so that our well-being isn't entirely consumed or caught up with whether the experience is pleasant or unpleasant, the experience itself. And can we start to look for our well-being and how we're relating with whatever happens? That's starting to point to a place more of freedom, so that and I think we all know that there's probably certain circumstances, you know, just look back in your life. You know, some of you I know and many of you I don't know, but I'm guessing if just by virtue of being around in this world long enough, hopefully we can look back, and I know for myself, I can see areas in my life that I used to suffer and struggle about quite a bit. And I can find at least something where I say, you know, around this one thing, I don't suffer around it like I used to. I'm freer around it. I'm able to work with it, to be with it, to let go around it. I've shifted my relationship with it some. If you can notice anything like that, that's an example. So there's two ways we get freedom. One is we do learn how to calm ourselves, steady ourselves, open our hearts more. All of these qualities we're cultivating, and those actually are ways we bring down the intensity of situations. And so we'll talk more about that in coming days. But connected with that, but it's a little different, is what do we do when we can't change the circumstances? And that's, if we can't bring the intensity down, we bring up the ability to be with it in a way that doesn't shake us off our balanced place. And so I don't know that we'll be perfect, but that's kind of the idea from a Dharma perspective of how we can aim ourselves. You know, we can say things like, here, I'll just read one more quote. This was from Goenka. Some of you know who he was. He died a few years ago. And the Vipassana meditation teacher, he said, real wisdom is recognizing and accepting that every experience is impermanent. With this insight, you will not be overwhelmed by ups and downs. And when you are able to maintain an inner balance, you can choose to act in ways that will create happiness for you and for others. Living each moment happily with an equanimous mind, you will surely progress toward the ultimate goal of liberation from all suffering. Now, I like that quote a lot. I think it's beautiful. I think it captures a lot of the essence of Dharma. And we often speak, when we speak of freedom, and Goenka didn't use this phrase himself, but we speak of sometimes liberation through non-clinging. So there's a whole piece that'll be threaded throughout our whole retreat together. What do we mean by non-clinging? And how do we really learn to let go or not cling? So we hear these beautiful quotes from these teachers. It doesn't sound hard, right? And I hear it, I think, yep, that's for me. I'm going to sign up for that. And then you find out that you can't do it. I mean, you can do it in a moment, right? But all it takes is the right causes and conditions to come together, and we're just caught again. we've all had times of what we call freedom from in a Dharma perspective. And we may not notice some of those times. We're just in a harmonious flow with life. We're not suffering, we're not struggling, things are just going along, where our hearts are at peace, our minds are balanced. So again, sometimes we don't recognize those places. We've all experienced those, but it just takes the right conditions, the right things to arise, and it'll trigger us off. We'll be caught again. So one of the beauties of coming on these retreats is that it can be a magnifier in this way. Because as we go about our business in our daily lives, hopefully we're bringing some awareness. But it's so easy to get caught in things and to get distracted. And the idea here is we're purposely trying to remove a certain amount of distractions. Of course, you may find this is an online retreat, and if you're practicing at home, you may find that just being in your home is a distraction because all your familiarity is there and all the things that pull you. So that may be there, but we're trying to set aside as many external distractions as we can to just be with ourselves. And then you notice what happens for those of you who are doing this as a retreat. You sit down to be with yourself, and the way I'm offering the suggestions is make your body, I've said it several times today, as comfortable as you can. You don't have to be in any fancy posture. Take care of yourself. I even recommended you customize the schedule to fit you. Sleep when your body tells you you need to sleep. Your body knows when it needs to eat. Follow your own rhythm. Don't be lazy and blow off the practice, but be attuned to your own inner knowing and guidance, right? Find your own way. You don't have to make anything. So make yourself comfortable, be in attunement with yourself. You don't have to even make anything happen. Just sit and be present with yourself. And we see how hard just that simple thing can sometimes be. Now, we do get to see, and if you haven't seen what I'm about to mention, you will, if you practice long enough, we get to see how profoundly beautiful our hearts and minds can be, for sure. And you'll discover places of just incredible, profound, I like the word beauty, within yourself. Maybe you hadn't even realized could be there. And you'll find places where maybe we will say that aren't so beautiful in you, and maybe you didn't even want to know was in there. So it all starts to reveal itself, and we get to. But this is our opportunity when we're talking about freedom. About the first thing is learning how just to be present with something. That, just the breath is teaching us that. When the Buddha spent a lot of time talking about suffering. But really, when you think about it, I don't think we really need the Buddha to tell us about suffering at all. We're all experts. We know all about it. What we're not experts at, and where I think all of us can use some help, I'm including myself in all of this, all of us as human beings, we need some help, is what to do about our suffering. And this goes back to this idea of, is it possible to shift, yes, learn how to bring down difficulties and smooth out our experience. That's important for sure. But also bringing up our ability to be with things. How do we learn how to be with difficulty? And so again, just sitting in comfortably and being with your breath, or doing loving kindness meditation when you're bored or something. That's a real teacher right there. What do we do with something when it's bored or some difficulty comes up? Or just to learn how to be with the breath. We're already starting to learn how to be with something. So what I want to do, especially for this first day of the retreat, one of the things that's typical is that the first day or two of a retreat are often the most difficult. It's not always true. We're all different, so you have to look to your own experience. But let's just say it's very common difficulties can arise at any point in a retreat, but particularly in the first few days until we start to settle down. Once we've settled a little bit, then we have the resources of a more steady mind, a more strengthened, wakeful awareness to meet the difficulties. Oftentimes in the beginning, when those aren't as well developed, we don't have them as resources. And so if you find that you're trying to do this retreat and you're just, going about your business, but actually difficulties can arise, which is common. I'm not saying it's supposed to, may not be. For myself, when I used to go on retreats, it doesn't happen anymore, but in the early years, without fail, the first day or two, all my self-esteem issues and my despair came roaring up. And it, took its own forms in my particular version of how that manifests. And, it was hard to sit and be with it and work with it and let it go. And it was a lot of suffering, and then it would settle out. So these things can come anytime, but if we want to spend a little time, especially what's very common on the first day retreat, because it can be so challenging. You'll often find talks like the one that I'm going to spend the rest of my time doing, which is some particular tips on working with difficulties. But everything I'm going to say fits. It's not just about working with difficulties in retreat, but I think it really is a lot of the things that can help us in the theme of finding freedom in difficult times. It's really right in alignment with that. And so the first piece, which is probably self-evident, is that if there's any chance for freedom, it hinges on mindfulness and wakefulness. We have to know what's happening, or we're just going to be caught in it. And I use, some of you have heard this many times, my own definition of mindfulness. There are many definitions. The one I like is just not being lost on automatic pilot. Sometimes when people lose their mindfulness, someone will say, oh, that person lost their mindfulness, they went unconscious. And it's clear what the person means when they say that, but of course you're not unconscious. You're just caught up in things, you're entangled, you're lost in it, you don't know. And it's when you we say, wake up and realize what's happening, you're back. That's when the mindfulness kicks in, you know what's happening. It's one thing to say, for example, to be angry, and that's very, very different than, but not know it, to be caught and lost in it. And, but that's very different than knowing what's happening and just being angry, but knowing that you're angry. At least you have a chance to respond wisely rather than just react. And some of you will hear that this is an example I often give. And so some of you will know the answer, but when we give meditation instructions about being with your breath, and it's a rhetorical question, you don't need to answer, but what is the instruction we give when you forget about your breath and you're just lost in thought? If we were all together in a room, someone would answer, well, the instruction is come back and start over. But actually it's a trick question, because when you're lost in thought, there is no instruction. You don't even know you're gone. It's only once you're already back, you've got your mindfulness, that the instruction can kick in. So in the same way, we can't worry about when you're lost and gone, because you can't do anything about it anyway. I mean, it is true, you're going to habitually react out of the conditioned patterns of your mind, and hopefully we don't create too much suffering and difficulty during those times. But you can't do anything about it anyway. You're going to just react out of just the patterns of your mind. Once your mindfulness is back, though, you have choice. Sometimes we still don't have choice because the force of something is so powerful, it will still pull us in certain directions. And I want to say a lot more on this retreat about that, because we have to respect the power of those forces that can pull us, even when we're aware of them. So a big piece of what we're developing is strengthening the mindfulness so that we're lost on automatic pilot less and less of the time. We're just naturally more awake and present. It's like a stream of wakefulness is just carrying through in our lives more and more. And when we do get lost, we're it's for less time or less deeply lost. So that's just what we're working on. But that's when we need to have a lot of self-empathy and kindness for ourselves too, because there's going to be times when we're going to get lost and then all bets are off. We just, what happens is going to happen. So that's the thing that's important to be working on, strengthening our mindfulness. Now, sometimes just mindfulness alone, you will notice for yourself, is enough. We just shine the light of awareness, we see what's happening, and it lets go. And so we talk about finding freedom and working with difficulties. Sometimes when we wake up out of the automatic pilot and we go, oh, I'm struggling, I'm reacting, that's all that's needed. It's enough. So you'll appreciate those times. But many times it's not enough. It's just the starting point, and we need to employ more skillful action. And I want to speak more about then, okay, what do we do when we see what's happening, but just being aware isn't enough? We need other things to help us. And I want to name just a few things. It's certainly very important when we talk about learning how to be present with something. One of the mistakes I think happens in the meditation world, at least in the Buddhist scene that I've been a part of, sometimes it can seem as if the answer to everything is just be mindful of it. Like that's the one answer for everything. I knew someone who went to a meditation center in Burma. This was many years ago. I think it was in the 1980s. And was doing just intensive retreat practice as we're doing here. And a lot of psychological old, I don't know the right words, wounds, difficulties, old childhood issues just came roaring up. And she was getting really overwhelmed by some of this that she hadn't even realized was in there. Some old, I think, if I remember correctly, maybe some abuse, or it was big stuff. And I'm not criticizing those teachers in Burma. I'm just saying what happened. I'm assuming they probably didn't have a lot of experience working with Westerners and Western psychology or whatever. And whatever was going on, they just simply said, well, did you note it? There's this mental noting, like in the instructions we give here. They would use a technique for mindfulness where you'd label it, like if there's anger, you would be mindful of the anger, but just repeat like anger, anger. It's a mental noting technique to help the anger. So no matter what happened, they just said, would you note it? Well, that wasn't even close to enough. She really, it was way too much for her. That wasn't helping. She was trying. Something else was needed. And the experience was too much. What was needed was an acknowledgement within herself that this is too much. I need to be able to bring the intensity down. Sometimes the answer actually is we do need to get away from something or figure out how to bring the intensity down. That is part of what we need in our toolkit. In this woman's case that I'm thinking of, she felt so, I don't know the right word, wounded, or it was so painful for her that she stopped meditation and just gave it up altogether. Wasn't in the Dharma world, wasn't in the Buddhist world, wasn't a meditator anymore. And that was the end of that for her. So it just didn't work for her, and it was too bad. Now, it's true that there will be times when you don't have the option to bring it down. And what I was talking about with the coronavirus, and that day, it was a half a day when I really fell into a lot of fear. Way back in the beginning, for about a half or 2/3 of a day, how am I going to bring it down? I can't make it go away. So it was all about, how can I work? Had a lot of awareness. I knew what was happening, but it was quite powerful. And I finally, found my way. So we have to recognize that we all have our situations in life where we can't fix this. We can't make it go away. But we want to recognize, so look, if you can't bring the intensity down and you're not able to bring up your ability to be with it, to strengthen that, then that's just a lot of suffering. It just is. And so that's when we really need a lot of compassion. And during those times, we're going to suffer. Right? I think all strategies are either bring down the intensity or bring up the strength in our resources to meet it. So the main point is we don't want to say, well, you should be able to be with this. So if you're sitting there, whatever, cross-legged in meditation, and it feels like, you know, you've got stabbing pain in your knee, the answer is not always be with it. Now, if you always move away when there's ever any pain, you'll never learn how to be with something. So yes, we need to find the balance when, and you have to feel it out yourself. When is the time to stay with something and just learn to hang out there and see, can I let go around it a little? But when is the time out of compassion when you need to stretch your knee out and take care of yourself? I knew someone who damaged their knee. They were on a retreat and they were having knee pain, and this meditation teacher said to them, that this is filtered through what the person told me the teacher said, basically, didn't even know them, just said, well, you don't need to stretch your knee out, just be with it. So they did, and they actually caused some knee problems. So it's not always the right answer. So sometimes we will err in one way or another. We'll hang in there with something difficult and painful, when really, you know what, it would have been good out of kindness to stretch your knee out or get up or move away, not stay with it. And when we out of balance that way, you know, okay, we suffered when we didn't need to. Other times it's the opposite. We moved away from something, and you know what, really probably could have been a good learning opportunity to hang in there with it. Okay, we missed an opportunity to learn that we could have had. So we don't have to have it perfect. And we won't, but over time we learn more and more through experience. And this comes into the part of learning how to trust ourselves. And so how do we learn what we can trust? Through experience. So you have to do the experiment. And so feel it out the best you can. You just make your best choice. And, you know, if you're too far out of balance one way or another, we'll learn. And over time, we will learn. So far I've offered that we need to have in our toolkit mindful awareness. If there's to be any chance of freedom, we have to be present. We have to recognize that some experiences may actually be too much for us, and this gets into there's not always one correct, so we just have to recognize that. The third thing I want to offer, and this is a biggie that we tend to, so in our meditation practice, first let me ask you a question. I realize you can't answer, it's a rhetorical question. What's a good meditation? What's a bad meditation? Let's be honest, we all know. A good meditation is when you're getting your way, your body's cooperating, your mind's concentrating, you're feeling full of whatever is this bliss I keep hearing about. Oh, I want some of that. You get some of whatever. It's pleasant, your mind's clear, steady. What's a bad meditation? Your body hurts, you can't concentrate, you're full of anger, your mind's dull or sleepy. You know, I can remember many times on retreat when the bell would ring, and it was such a sweet, beautiful sit. I would say to myself, you know, I think I'm going to sit and just hang out and be with this a little longer before I get up and go walking. You know, I don't know how many times I've said, you know, my body is really hurting. I can't concentrate. I'm just totally restless, or I'm falling asleep. I'm just dull, or I'm full of anger. You know, I think I'm not going to get up quite yet. I think I'm going to hang out with this and be with it a little more. You know, I think in general, people don't tend to do that so much because we tend to judge our meditation. But I think life is like that, right? And so what happens is we think I'm having, oftentimes people will come and when they want to talk about their meditation and they'll say, I was having this great meditation, then it all fell apart. Well, it didn't fall apart. It just changed. It's just what's happening. There's actually not such a thing as a good or a bad meditation. There's simply whatever's happening. And a lot of what we'll talk about on the retreat is how to work with the whole range of ups and downs that come included in. So we want to learn not to judge our practice by how pleasant it is. Well, it gets a little tricky because life is actually the same thing, and I want to be very respectful here. We have to be careful when we talk about not judging life by how pleasant or unpleasant it is, because we're really, I need to pause here. I want to divide kind of life into two groups just for the sake of our discussion. There's a whole lot of life. It may not be your life, but you don't have to look far in this world where the way it is for people, it's not okay. It just needs to change. You wouldn't even talk about learning to be with it, let go. If you're in a war zone, if you just anywhere in the world, in this country, and you're one of the 40, 50 million people who've lost your job and you're in fear about how you're going to pay your next rent, or you've gotten sick, or someone is sick or die, or you're, and everything we hear about issues around inequality and social justice, and we could just go on and on. There's a lot of life where I don't think we would say, let it be. We want to try to change these things, and we should. And I hope this gets in the whole thing of being socially engaged. And we're not going to talk so much about that on this retreat, but because I'm going to spend time talking about the parts of life where we learn how to let go and let be, but to be respectful and acknowledge of all the parts of life where, now I do want to say, if something difficult is happening and you're not able to let it be, then yes, we will suffer during those times. So maybe the better way to speak about all of these things where I say they should change, you just take in our society and all the areas in which, say, inequality and issues around social justice and injustice arise, just to pick one, and that's a huge topic. Well, and I would use different language for that. I wouldn't talk about learning to be or let it be or not. I would speak, you will have your own way, but for me, I would speak more in terms of how can I bring as much balance and equanimity to meet the situation as I can while I'm engaged in the process of trying to move in a better direction. People often think, well, I shouldn't have equanimity about this thing. It's terrible. What do you mean have equanimity about it? But we have to be careful what we mean. And I want to give you an example. I used to teach a lot of prison meditation work for several decades. I started in the 1970s and up until around 1990. And I even started a couple of Dharma meditation groups in a couple of I used to be a Buddhist chaplain in a couple of state prisons. And those programs are still going. I don't do that work anymore. And one of the prisons I worked in, it was Salinas Valley State Prison down near Soledad here in California. And it's a level 4 prison, a really, really tough place. It's kind of like when you hear in this state, they use Pelican Bay as an example of a really rough place. Well, this is another one of those places. It's where they send people who have committed crimes in other prisons and they can't make it and they send them here. So it's rough. So one day, a guy it's a men's prison, so it's all men. I went into, this guy comes up to me and he wanted my advice on what to do. He was part of a gang. I think it was like the Latinos. There's the Sureños and the Norteños, the Southerners and the Northerners. I don't fully know, but he was in one of those. And he said, in retaliation for the other gang stabbing someone in his gang, he's been assigned by his gang to go and stab someone else in the other gang. He wanted my advice on what to do. And he said to me, I'm a Dharma guy now. I'm not going to go stab somebody, but what am I going to do? If I don't do it, my own gang's going to come after me. So first of all, I had to be very respectful. I'm getting ready to walk out of there in a couple of hours, back to the safety and security of my own life. So I can't be glib and disrespectful and offer my profound Buddhist teacher wisdom to him. He's living in there. So I didn't know what to tell him. And so what I said to him was, I don't really know I don't know the answer, but here's the piece of advice I can think to offer you. To the extent you're able to meet the situation with less reactivity, you do the best you can. I know this is super hard, but to any degree, if you can meet the situation with less reactivity and more, we get into this equanimity or balance, you have a better chance of coming up with a better solution. And then I didn't see him for a few months. And then finally he was back in the group, and I was wondering, well, what happened? And it turned out he came up with a pretty, I thought, given the limited options, a pretty good choice. He said to me he wasn't going to stab anybody. So he decided that they call them shanks. It's a homemade, like they take a piece of plastic or anything and they make them in these points. So it's like a homemade knife. And he was out on the yard where everyone can see, and there's the other person over there that he's supposed to stab. He went for him and lunged for the other person. And he said on purpose, he tripped and stumbled as he was going for him and just barely grazed the person, maybe on their shirt. So he didn't actually stab anyone, but it looked to everyone, he satisfied his gang that he tried and did his part, but he didn't end up. And then he ended up in, they call it the hole. He was in solitary confinement for a few months. And he said he took it on, this is his words, not mine. He said he took it on as his karma. He acknowledged that he did his crime. And it's not from, I don't want to get into, I don't know his background, all the areas of, gets into social justice and what his upbringing and circumstances were. I'm just saying he himself used the term, he goes, this was my karma. I took it on and to be in solitary, and he did that. Now, I don't really know, but I like to think that that's a good example of when we're not caught in fight or flight, we're able to actually respond rather than react. That's what I mean. I don't know if you'd call that story a happy ending. It's probably about as good an outcome maybe as it could be. That's what I mean about the side of life where we really do want to change things, but if we can meet it with as much clarity as possible. Sometimes if there's a lot of difficulty going on around us, even with the coronavirus, it just takes a few people who can not panic and maintain a steady presence, that it can maybe carry all the rest of us through. So that's that whole part of life. So everything else I'm talking about are all these other parts of life where it really would serve us better to use more of the language of learning to just bring awareness with things, to bring an open-hearted mind to things. So I'm using that kind of a language. And that's one of the things I'm talking about when we don't judge things by how pleasant or unpleasant it is. Because if we do that, just like with our meditation, we're caught up in, oh, this is a bad sit, this is a good sit. And so, it goes back to what Haridasa's quote about how we seek happiness. And it's that same thing that, no one here is trying to have less of what you want. I know I said this earlier, but it bears repeating. And none of us here are trying to have more unpleasant and less pleasant. So we're going to keep doing that. But we just have to hold it a little lighter, I think. I think those forces are still going to be with us. So it's more about how do we relate to what's happening. And if you can remember that, just starting that once in a while to think, okay, this is happening, I'm reacting. let me turn the lens onto how I'm relating to it. And we just start to notice the reactivity or not. And maybe the starting point is just with that. So from a Dharma perspective, the ostensibly the way it's presented is, you'll hear it said that literally every moment holds a possibility of awakening and freedom. I don't know the answer to that because I have not reached the end of this path. I don't actually know if, I shouldn't say this in the Dharma teacher role, I don't actually know if there is an end to the path from my own experience. I can't say, I can't particularly answer that, but I do know we don't have to worry about that. There is a path and it moves in a good direction. We don't have to be to whatever our idea of the end of the path is to come to a place where we do learn to let go more deeply and profoundly. And our heart learns to stay open more and more of the time in a wider range of what comes to us, with more challenging people, with ourself more. So I think, let me just offer another thing that I found helpful for me. I remember a time when I'd been on a very long retreat. This was a 1 year long. And so, it was a long time. It was just like this, just practicing by myself in a room. And I remember doing walking meditation. I was very deep into it, maybe halfway in the middle. And one day I realized I was having some difficulties come. And whatever was coming up in my mind, it was difficulty. And I realized that I felt just as interesting, I would call them the storm clouds of the mind would come through. There's an image, I think Jack Kornfield uses this, maybe others, it was like, he talks about the mind like a big sky. And then all these things come floating through. And, the clouds come through, so the happiness comes through, the pleasant, the joy. And then the difficulties come through. And even deep in your meditation, deep in your retreats, it can happen. And when I realized I was just as interested in my suffering as I was in my bliss, it was a big shift. It really is possible. And more of my attention was on how am I relating to it all? And we start to see that it's all coming and going. That fear around the coronavirus that I spoke of earlier, that is not there right now. It came and went, right? So we start to see these more, and it doesn't mean it's still painful and hard when it comes, but we can start to see that these are changing experiences, and we a little bit learn not to hold on to them as much to give us some perspective. So that is that's an important place, I have to say, when we, some people will say, you're crazy. What do you mean get interested in my suffering? But think about it. If we want to come to know the cause of our suffering, we have to understand our suffering. Well, how is it that we understand anything? It's through experience. That's how you gain understanding. And so I think sometimes we can be out of balance in the Buddhist world because it seems like all they talk about is the Four Noble Truths, suffering and the cause of suffering. And it seems like, what's with you Buddhists? All you talk about is suffering all the time. And that's not the whole picture. And it isn't. There's also happiness in life. The reason there's a lot of focus on suffering is because we do need, if we want to learn how our minds work and how we relate to our suffering and learn to let it go more, we need to come to understand it. But I think just as important, we need to get in touch with everything that's good and right in us. We don't just want to look for the suffering and everything that's wrong. We want to, it's not egotistical to find and connect with and appreciate everything that's good and right and beautiful about you, about your mind. We'll say more about that later on the retreat, but I think it's the other half of the picture, and it's just as important. You need access to that and to everything that works well in you. So when you need it, you can go back to it as a resource, as a refuge. So that's a piece, but also we need to come to understand the suffering, and you understand it through experience. Now, we have to be careful. I'm not saying you need to go out seeking suffering so you can get some experience. In case you haven't noticed, it will find you. Suffering will find you. Just sit down quietly in a room, hang out for a while without distractions. Suffering will come. Your body will start to hurt. You'll get bored. You'll think, what am I doing? This practice is stupid. Damn that Shankman, whatever it's going to be, you'll be in some suffering. You don't have to go seeking it. There is a respect path of practice, especially in more of the traditional Asian countries, that actually go seek out suffering so you have a chance to sit and be with it, to work with it. So, if that's your path, I think that must serve certain people well. I'm of a different school of thought. I'm of the school of thought that if we put a lot of attention into caring for ourselves, being kind to ourselves, caring for our bodies, listening to ourselves, respecting what our body tells us of when it needs to sleep and eat, and just our own drives and impulses and all of just who we are without having to make an excuse just because that's who you are. I find when people really are able to be kind to themselves in this way, they don't get lazy and stop practicing. I find that people feel more safe and more relaxed and are actually able to practice well. And then when the suffering comes, though, yes, then we want to be willing and able to open and turn to it, or at least be open. Sometimes turning into it can feel a little much, but sometimes it's needed. We feel like we need to really turn ourselves into the suffering, let ourselves have our suffering. But sometimes it's a lighter touch. So this getting a little ahead of our instructions in working with suffering on the retreat. But for now, just this idea that when it comes, we don't want to fall into a habitual reactivity, but just to know what's happening and then being receptive of it, to let it teach us. And that is a profound shift if we can start to see our suffering, or just, let me back up. You don't have to say, just life as our teacher more. I'm thinking about perhaps a whole talk just on this theme of life as our teacher. It's actually an important place. I will say it this way for now. One of the strengths and important things, I may have mentioned this yesterday, I don't remember, but I really relate to it a lot, is this idea that we have an inner, I really feel this is literally true. It's not just feel good, happy talk, an inner profound place of wisdom, of knowing. I call it our inner teacher, our inner guidance, our inner self, our inner knowing. And a lot of what practice could be thought of as connecting with it so it becomes actualized and more alive. Woken up, our connection with it is more alive, more and more. And when that happens, we don't want to be arrogant and think nobody can teach us anything. And we don't want to think we know everything. No, of course not. But we learn that we don't need the externals to guide us so much, because we know within ourselves what we can trust. It comes from experience. So you have to be willing to stay open to the whole range of your experience in the spirit of letting it teach you. And what is it teaching you? Well, if you're in the spirit of finding freedom, then it's, how do I find freedom? Maybe you hold it as a question or a koan. What's stopping me from finding the freedom in a moment? And sometimes the answer is, well, this is just too much. And then so be it. I remember I've used this example, I think on the last retreat last month, so you may have heard this before. when I first started my meditation, I started when I was 18 years old. I was like probably 18 or 19. I was very idealistic and naive. And I went to the dentist to have a tooth, whatever, tooth filled or something. And they were going to give me he was going to give me the Novocaine. I told him not to give me the Novocaine. I just wanted to stay. I said something dumb like, let the experiences arise and pass away. I don't know what he thought about me. He must have thought I was crazy. I was crazy because you know what? I did it, by the way, without the Novocaine. It wasn't even close. It blew me away. I couldn't be present with that. There was, it's not like you should. There's no should here. You either can or you can't. It was so far beyond my limit. You would have thought I would have stopped and said, Doc, hold on a second. You better numb me up. He'd probably be way more relaxed. I know I would have. I just, memories kind of get exaggerated over the years, so I don't know how accurate, but I have a memory of having a death grip on where your armrests are. And I always made a joke that if he's still around to this day and has that old chair, I bet my finger imprint's still in there. So look, this is the skill of knowing when to move away and when to move towards something. But in the spirit of not being led around by our likes and dislikes, but in the spirit of coming to learn and grow in wisdom and grow in discernment. That's the key that we're aiming for. And knowing that you don't have to get it perfect. And in fact, I'll just tell you ahead of time, none of us are going to get it perfect. We'll screw things up. We act in ways we shouldn't have. But the question is then we make an action, whether it's conscious or unconscious, then we get the feedback. It's a built-in feedback mechanism. And I think that you could think of that as the learning tools of the earth if we're willing to hold it that way. And even if we do something wrong and we create some suffering, I did something I have with my son. I have a teenage son and we have a good relationship. It's mostly fine, but I did something, wasn't the worst thing in the world, but I acted in a way that wasn't good. And, I messed up. I got reactive. So what did I do? I went to him and I said, I owned up to it and didn't feel good. And I told him, right? I did do this. I acknowledged it. I feel bad about it and everything. He appreciated it. So it's fine to screw up, but then it's like, how do we hold it? Do we tear ourselves down? There's this idea of remorse in Buddhism, and there's a healthy remorse, and that's different than a regret that we can't let go of. A healthy remorse feels that didn't feel so good. It's not in alignment with who I want to be, and so we feel the kind of the bad feeling of it to learn, and then we also don't lose the compassion and kindness for ourselves, right? And so we move forward in life, staying attuned with our intention, and so I hope, we're coming to the end here. I'm going to wrap up. Really, to summarize what I wanted to get at today is. I think the main points was the idea of starting to at least be open to the possibility of, can we make a shift in where we seek our well-being? So it's not only in circumstances, it's not only in the experience, but it's in our own hearts and minds. How I relate with whatever's happening is a way to think about it. How I hold it, how I be with it. Can I learn to let go? Can I learn to keep? So I'll just say this, my own practice, I still have, after all these years, I still have a formal daily meditation practice. I still meditate a fair amount. And I don't know what would happen if I stopped. I haven't done the experiment. And I've appreciated, I think the formal practice it's a big deal, I think. But each of us find our own relationship with that. We don't all have these formal practices. For some of us, our practice is more about how we move about in our daily lives. And so for me, I have found that for myself, the leading edge of my practice isn't really the sitting anymore, although it still continues to unfold and grow. For me, my leading edge has gotten very simple. As I move about in my life, I'm either in the stream of non-clinging with an open heart, or I've gotten caught in reactivity and clinging, and or my heart's closed off. I use this phrase, the stream of non-clinging, so that's kind of a funny phrase. It's my own way of how I experience it, but stream of wakefulness, of non-clinging, stream of Dharma. There's a lot of terms, but as it becomes more alive, as I know some of you who I know what I'm talking about from your own experience. Wakeful present, and my heart's open. I really don't have to do anything. I just live. I don't want to go on automatic pilot, but I just live. And then when my heart closes off, my job is to let go. When I've caught in clinging, when my heart closes off, it's to open the heart. When I've caught in clinging, it's to let go. And it's gotten very, very simple. And it doesn't mean I have to be able to do it, but it means because that's my larger aspiration or intention around the Dharma, to deepen in the ability to rest in the stream of non-clinging and to live with an open heart in an ever-widening range of people and experiences, then I'm looking for, in that spirit of life being my teacher, for it to be my teacher. And then it's okay when I find my edge. I call them learning edges where I fall short. That's all right. Oh, it shows me a place where more work needs to be done. And even in the spirit of, like take, for example, if there's ill will or anger, I'll say more actually maybe tomorrow night about it. There's times to let things go and there's times to be with them, and how we do it. This is more details on what's skillful. So there's a lot of detail I can't talk about, but it's just holding the idea of what is my deepest intention for how I want to live and be. Can I hold that in my mind? And then as I meet up against the flow of experiences, let's just see how I'm doing with that. And that's enough for now. And if you can't do it, or you fall flat on your face and you end up in suffering, it's like, it's going to happen. And so we don't have to be perfect, but you'll find that just in the doing, your ability to rest in that flow of wakefulness or liberation will grow. And I'll end with this example that I think is a great example. My son is he's quite an accomplished jazz trombone player. He's really, it's just amazing kid. When he first started playing on that trombone, he had no skill at all, none. Couldn't even get one tone out. It's hard to play a brass instrument if you haven't. I've tried to myself. It's to actually make even a single tone. Now he made all-state junior high jazz band. He's up there playing like crazy. But when he started, and the reason I use that as an example is you don't have to have any skill at what we're talking about here in the Dharma at all. You don't want to fall into judging yourself. You don't have to be, this is kind of a weird way to say it, but trying to be a little humorous. You don't have to be any good at it. None. It's just in the bringing to it the best you can. It's in the doing that it grows. It's a wonderful way, the way it works in the Dharma. And it works that way for everyone. It's just like my son, the trombone. Some teachers said to him, well, try your lips this way, but he had to sit there and try to do what they were saying, right? He had to apply it himself, and it's in the feeling his way through, it grew. And so I think that's really good news, so we won't fall into being hard on ourselves or judging ourselves, that we can just start where we are, stay in touch with our intention, and then when we forget and we're lost, fine, but when we remember, try our best to just open to the possibility of letting go and being with things, even if it feels feeble to us. And I think that way will naturally open and grow. So I think that's enough for now. I think really the whole rest of the retreat, one way to think about it, because I've been thinking about the future talks and the meditation instructions, really is taking exactly what I've been talking about now and has been more like, well, how are some more details? Let's discuss more details of how to actually do it. So that's kind of the idea for that.